Now that we got started with this course, and now that you have a first understanding of what SQL is and what you could use it for, and how relational database management systems work, it's time to install some databases in this course section. Because, of course, you can use SQL outside of relational database management systems as well, as you learned in the first course section. You can, for example, use it for data science, for analyzing data in files with help of certain frameworks. But the most prominent use case for using SQL probably is that you do have a relational database and that you do want to query it with SQL. It's also simply easier to learn SQL if you have a database where you can create, update, delete, read, change, and filter data just as you want. It's simply easier to play around with that. And that's why in this course section, we'll have a look at what we will actually install, which database engines we're going to use in this course. Before we then go ahead and do install these database engine servers and various clients to connect to them, so that we do have database servers up and running and tools for talking to these servers and for sending queries. And as a last step, we'll set up a nice little playground, you could say, an environment that we'll use in this course to create and run our queries. We will install various clients that we could use for that throughout this section, but there is one specific setup which we'll dive into in this course section, which makes running and creating and storing queries simply a bit easier, especially if you are learning SQL. So these are the things we'll dive in. Now, as a little side note, of course you could skip this course section and not install anything. If you either already know how to install and set up a database server like MySQL or PostgreSQL, or if you don't plan on executing queries on your own, but you instead just want to watch the videos. In that case, you don't need to go through the hassle of downloading and installing software. You can just skip this section. If you do want to follow along though, and you don't know already how to install and set up database servers, then this section is for you. Now, in this course, as mentioned before, you will learn SQL in general. We'll not focus on SQL for one specific database only. Instead, you will learn SQL such that you can use it with any database or with any data science, data analytics framework. Nonetheless, to run some examples, to show you some examples, we need a database so that we have something to work with, simply so that we don't just dive into boring theory, but so that we are able to execute certain queries and commands, and we see how SQL works in reality. And therefore, in this course, we will use MySQL and PostgreSQL, the two most popular free-to-use database engines and database systems, as database systems for those examples. But again, the SQL syntax we show you will generally work with other database systems or other use cases as well. Now, MySQL and PostgreSQL will be the focus of this course, and as you will see throughout this course, there are cases, there are scenarios where the syntax is not exactly the same when we execute a certain command. For MySQL, it might be slightly different than it will be for PostgreSQL, and of course, we'll do our very best to highlight these cases to make you aware of that. Nonetheless, it's generally a good idea if you, once you know with which database or analytics framework you will be working, also dive into the official documentation of that framework or database. simply by searching for its official site. And then on that official site, you typically find the official documentation where you learn about the exact syntax that is supported by that system or that framework you're working with. But the vast majority of commands and syntax will show you will work for all database systems and SQL use cases in general. But for this course, as mentioned, we will use MySQL and PostgreSQL for our examples. And therefore, the next step, of course, is to install MySQL and PostgreSQL on our systems. And you can install MySQL and PostgreSQL no matter which operating system you're using. These database engines run on macOS, on Linux, and of course also on Windows. And we'll show you both the macOS and Windows installation of both these engines step by step in this course in the next lectures. Before we install anything, let's understand what exactly we need to install. Which kind of tools and functionalities do we need? For this, it's super important to understand that when you are working with a database engine like MySQL or PostgreSQL or any other engine, you have two key parties that are involved. You have the database system server, and you'll have some client software which connects to that server, which will send the actual queries. So we'll have that client-server communication, and therefore we'll need to install and set up both. We'll need a database server on our machine for development and for testing this. And if you would be building a real website, for example, you would also deploy a real database server, either by using a hosted and managed service, like the AWS Relational Database Service, for example, but there are many alternatives as well. Or you would set up your own remote machine with your own database system configured on it. And during development, we want to have a database server on our local machine so that we can run queries against it, that we can use it to store dummy and example data, and that we can use it to learn the SQL syntax and the key commands. Now, the client is what we'll need to send these commands. Now, if we start with the server, we will install the MySQL and the PostgreSQL servers, and I will show you in the next lectures how you do set up those servers. And when it comes to the client, there we actually have a broad variety of clients we could be using for sending those queries and for connecting to these servers. When we are working with MySQL and when we are installing MySQL, there are actually two built-in tools that come together with the MySQL server, you could say, that you can use for connecting to that server and for sending queries. And that would be MySQL Workbench, which is a graphical user interface, which can be very convenient for diving into the database and the data and the structure there in a graphical way. Or the MySQL command line tool, which is a tool you use from inside your command prompt or terminal or bash to run queries to send commands to that server. For PostgreSQL, you also have such a command line tool, but besides that, you also have many other options for all database systems, so no matter which database system you're using. For example, there are various third-party tools that you could be using for connecting to a database server and interacting with it. For example, for macOS, you have SQL Pro, and there also are alternatives for Windows. And SQL Pro can be used to connect to MySQL databases. There also are more general third-party packages and software that can be used to connect to any database system, not just to MySQL. This is just an example. And you could be using a tool like this to connect to a database and run commands against it. This would be an alternative so that you also have some kind of graphical user interface and you're not using the one that comes together with the database. So third-party tools like SQL Pro also exist and help you connect and talk to databases. Now, there is one thing all these clients I listed thus far have in common. You would be using them as a developer or administrator to run queries manually against your database. Now, very often, of course, you use a database as part of your website or your mobile app. And new data should be written to the database whenever a user signs up or buys a product. In such cases, you don't want a client where you, the developer, run a command. Instead, the command should be executed automatically by the website or by the mobile app that is being used by the user. And that is a very common use case, of course, and therefore another very common client that will be used very often is a specific package or driver that you use inside of your application code. So that will be another very common client to be used. But for development and for learning SQL and so on, we of course do want to run commands manually because then we have full control over them and we can learn them step by step. Therefore, we could be using one of the first four options, MySQL Workbench, the command line tools, or a third-party tool. But in this course, we'll use a different alternative. We will use a code editor called Visual Studio Code and then a specific extension for that editor. This will be very similar to using a command line tool or a specific third-party tool. The main difference and benefit and reason for us using VS Code with an extension for this course here is that this will allow us to save the commands that we do run into code files, and we make those code files available to you. In the last lecture of this first course section, you find a link to all the course code, and that includes all the commands that we execute. So that allows us to record and explain these commands and also save them so that we can provide them to you so that you can download and run those commands in case you're getting errors with your commands and you want to compare your commands to ours. That's why we use this last approach. Technically, it's the same as if we would be using Workbench or the command line tools because we still have a client where we manually issue commands against a SQL server, but with the extra benefit of us being able to save these commands into files. And we also have this nice to look at user interface, which should make it very easy to follow along with the course. Now, therefore, coming back to what we need to install, we need the database server and we need such a client. And then the next lectures will install all of that. I will also show you how you would be using MySQL Workbench or the command line tools, but then thereafter, we will also set up Visual Studio Code with that extension so that thereafter we can dive into learning SQL step by step. So let's start installing some database servers and engines and clients. And in this lecture, I'll give you a brief overview of the MySQL installation because we're going to get started with setting up MySQL in this lecture. And then for the majority of this lecture, we'll install MySQL on macOS. Now you can skip to the next lecture if you're using Windows, because there I will show you how to set up MySQL on Windows, but you should stick around for the brief overview of the MySQL installation, with which I'll start right now. Because to install MySQL, you can of course visit the official MySQL page, which you can also find by just searching for MySQL. And there, it's always a good idea to explore the official documentation to find detailed instructions on how you can install this software, MySQL, the MySQL server, for different operating systems. Though it will be even easier to find the installation documentation if you search for MySQL installation, and then here you find a direct link to the MySQL installation guide, where you can learn how to set up MySQL on different operating systems, including Windows and macOS, and also Linux. However, and that's really important also for Windows later, there are different versions of MySQL and the MySQL server. For example, there is this MySQL database service, which is a managed paid service that you could be using, but that we will not use in this course because it's paid. There also is the Enterprise Edition, which is also paid. We will be using the Community Edition instead, which has all the same base features, all the features we need, and also great performance, but which is free to use. And therefore we'll switch to these community downloads instead. Alternatively, you can also search for Download MySQL Community. And then we need that MySQL Community server. And you can pick the latest version there. For me, it currently is version 8. something. Now here on this page, you can select your operating system, and you find a link to this page attached to this lecture, by the way, so that we all operate on the same page. And then here, for macOS, since that is what I'll get started with, you can download your package, your software installer. Now here I'll choose the top download, the top one here, which includes the SQL server, and I choose this one because I'm on an M1 Mac, so I need the ARM version. If you're on an Intel Mac, you would choose the x86 version and download that. And that will then give you an installer through which you can walk and through which we'll walk together in a couple of seconds that will install the MySQL server on our system. So I'll download this. And then on this next page, you're asked to log in, but actually you don't need to do that. You can just click no thanks, just start my download. And that's what I'll do here. And this will then download this MySQL package onto the system so that we can then use that to install the MySQL server. So now the download finished, and I can now start this installer here. So here's the installer opened up, and I will now simply walk through it and generally keep the default settings, enter my user password here when I'm prompted for it, and let it generally install everything here. And then here, once we reach configuration, we can use either of the two options. I'll go with the strong password encryption here, and then click next. And then you have to choose a password for the root user. This is a user that will be created for the database server. Because when we connect with a client to a database server, we will need to authenticate. In reality, not everyone should be able to talk to our database because we, of course, want to protect the data that's in it. That's why we need users with passwords for the database server, just as we have a user for our own personal machine or for our Amazon account, for example. Now, such a user with the name root is created automatically here. You can also create users manually thereafter if you want to have multiple users on your database. But here we'll go with the default user, and we'll use that default user for connecting to the database with our client later. And that default user will have a name of root, but now we also need to assign a password. And therefore I will do that here and choose a password, and then I will click finish here. Now I need to enter my user password again. This time the regular password of your macOS user, not the password you just entered here for the database user. And with that, the MySQL software should be installed on your system. So we can now finish this process. So now we installed the MySQL server, and it already should be up and running. You can confirm this by going to your system preferences on macOS, and there you should now have a new MySQL option, which you can choose where you actually have that SQL server, which you can also stop and restart from there. And here you can also control whether it should start up automatically when your computer starts, and I will, for example, disable this here so that I have to start it manually whenever I want to use it. You, of course, should make sure that this SQL server is up and running whenever you want to work with it. Under configuration, you can also control where the actual database data will be stored on your hard drive, because at some point it, of course, still will be written to your hard drive. The database engine is just an intermediate software between your data and the data being written on the hard drive. And you can, of course, change these paths if the actual data should be stored somewhere else. but I'll keep those defaults. Now that was the SQL Server. The server is not enough though. We also need clients, as you learned. And for this, I'll go back to the MySQL community downloads here. So on this download page, I'll click on MySQL community downloads. And here we downloaded the server. Now I also want to download the shell, which is this MySQL command line tool I mentioned before, and the workbench. So I'll go to MySQL shell here and also choose macOS here and then download this shell for my M1 Mac. Start this download. And whilst this is downloading, I will already also go back and download the MySQL workbench, which is this graphical user interface. There is no ARM version of that, so I'll use the x86 version for my M1 Mac and run it via Rosetta. So I'll download this as well here, like that. Now I'll start with the shell and open this installer here. Here we go, that's the installer for the shell. And I'll simply walk through it here, agree to the license, and install this shell. Again, enter my password for my Mac user, and install this shell, which is this command line client, and click close. Now we also downloaded MySQL Workbench, and if you double click on that download, you should be greeted with this trivial installer where you just drag MySQL Workbench into the applications folder here. And this will then install MySQL Workbench, this graphical client, this graphical user interface client on your macOS system. So I'll also do this now. Now with all of that installed and with the SQL Server up and running on macOS, you should be able to open your terminal and in there run MySQL. This command should now be available since you installed the MySQL shell. If you get command not found, you need to make sure that this install shell is available as a global command. To make it available as a command, you can go to your user folder in the Finder, make sure you show hidden files with Command-Shift dot by default, and there you should have a .set profile file which you can edit. If you don't have that file yet, you can simply create it with any text editor. So here I'll just open this with TextEdit and edit this file. And in that file, I'll just add this entry here where I write export whitespace path equals /user with USR /local /MySQL /bin $path where path is written all uppercase. That's what I add here. And then I'll close this. And if you now close your terminal and restart it, you should be able to execute MySQL. And you should now get a different error that tells you that access was denied because running it just like this indeed is incorrect. Instead, now we can use MySQL to connect to the database, but we'll do that and learn about MySQL Workbench in one of the later lectures in this section, because now we have that installed, we have the server installed. Now we want to do the same for Windows before we then see how we can connect with those different clients to the different database systems. Now we installed MySQL, the MySQL server and the client tools on macOS. Now we'll install it on Windows. For this here on Windows, again, I'll search for MySQL download community to find that server download again. But I will actually go to MySQL community downloads instead, and there choose the MySQL installer for Windows. Because the convenient thing about this is that this is one installer that will allow us to install all the things, server and client tools, in one step, which is more convenient than installing the things individually as we had to do it for macOS, though you could of course also do that if you preferred this. But here I'll choose the MySQL installer for Windows, and then there we got two options, a big one and a small one. It's up to you which one you choose. The big one already has all the tools included. The small one will download them as needed during the installation. And I'll pick the small one since I won't be installing everything, but just a couple of selected tools. So start this download here, and then run this installer here on Windows. Now here on Windows, we can now choose a setup type, and we got various options. As you see, you can install all the products for development, just a server, just a client, everything you can install, or custom. And that's the option I'll choose here so that we can pick the tools we need. And then I'll click Next. And now here, I'll go to MySQL servers and install the MySQL server, and here's simply that latest version. Move that to the right so that it is scheduled for installation. You don't need to install multiple servers for this course. You might need that if you, need to support different servers or you want to try out features that only existed for older servers. But for this course, we can use the latest version. Then for applications, we want to install the MySQL Workbench. So here I'll pick that latest version and install this. This is this graphical user interface, and the MySQL shell, which is this command line tool, which will be an alternative to Workbench as a client. So I'll pick the latest version there as well. And that is it. We don't need a router. We don't need any of these connectors here. We need these free tools. And with that selected, I'll click Next now. Now these tools will be downloaded and then installed if we click Execute. So that's what I'll do now. And that should be relatively fast. Once the download's finished, I'll click Next again. And then click Execute to install all these tools on the system. So let's wait for this installation to finish here. So now the installation did complete for me here. We can click Next again. And now we'll configure those various products that were installed. All of that is included in this installer, which is very convenient. So let's click Next again. And now here we start with configuring the server. And we got more options here than we did for macOS, but you can keep all the defaults here, like the port, for example, which will configure which port has to be used for connecting to the MySQL server later. And 3306 is the default for SQL databases, and it is a port we can use on our local machine without issues as well, and therefore we'll stick to that. So I'll click Next here. Now I'll choose the strong password encryption here as well, just as I did it on macOS. And now we have to set this root user password. I explained it for macOS, but in case you skipped that, the idea here is that our database server has user accounts. Not everyone should be able to connect to our database server just like this. We have data on it that should be protected, and therefore we have accounts on that database server, and only clients, no matter if that's MySQL Workbench, the command line tool, or an application, only clients that know the username password combination should be able to talk to the database so that the data on there is secured. Now, this MySQL installer will create a default user for you, a default user with the name root. And now you need to set a password for this default user here, which I will do here. I will use a fairly simple one here for development. If you would deploy your SQL database, you of course would want to choose a strong password. So I'll pick this. You could add more users, but for the moment this root user is enough, and hence I'll click Next here. And now you can choose to configure the MySQL server as a Windows service. This means that it will run in the background behind the scenes, and you can start it automatically whenever your system starts if you check this box. I will uncheck it, and I'll show you how you can manually start and stop it in just a second. So I uncheck this, but I keep the service checkbox checked. I want to have this behind the scenes service running for my SQL database server. So I'll choose these options and click Next. And now we can click Execute to execute this configuration for this MySQL server. which again will make sure that this server can be launched and started on our local system, on our local machine, so that we can work with it from inside there. Now, once all the steps were executed, you can click Finish and click Next. And now we finished all the setup. You can now start the MySQL Workbench and shell after the setup, but I'll uncheck both and start them manually instead. So click Finish again here, and let me now show you how you can start these extra clients, specifically for the shell. For this, you can open your Windows starting menu, and then in there just type MySQL, and at some point this MySQL shell should be suggested, and you can click on it to start it. And I'll show you how to work with this shell in a later lecture. For the moment, we can just close it. Now, one important note about the SQL Server, I did configure it as a service, and therefore one thing you can do here in that Start menu, you can search for Services and open this Services Windows app. And in there, you will find this MySQL service. If you scroll down to M, there you should find this service. You were able to choose that name during the installation. MySQL 80 was the default name for me here. And you see it's running. Now by clicking on it with a right click, or with these options on the left here, you can stop and restart it. And that allows you to always stop it if you don't want to work with that database anymore, and then start it again if you rebooted your system or if you simply want to pick up development with that database again. And of course, it always has to be up and running if you want to run queries against it and if you want to execute SQL commands against this database. But with that, we now also got SQL set up on Windows. And before we now dive into the various clients we can use and also set up that Visual Studio Code extension client, I also want to show you how you do install PostgreSQL in the next lecture. Now, we did install MySQL, the MySQL software, in the previous lectures. And of course, that is all you need. You don't need to install multiple servers. But in this course, we want to show you examples for both MySQL and PostgreSQL, because as mentioned, generally the SQL syntax will be the same, but sometimes there are subtle differences which we also want to highlight, and therefore we will use both MySQL and PostgreSQL, and you can of course also use both, though one of the two is enough. Or none of the two if you just want to watch the videos and not execute the commands on your own, which of course also would be fine. In this lecture, we're now going to install PostgreSQL. We're going to install PostgreSQL for macOS. In the next lecture, just as before with MySQL, we're going to install PostgreSQL for Windows. If you do want to install PostgreSQL, you can start by searching for PostgreSQL installation, and you should find this download page on postgresql.org. Just as for MySQL, a link to this page will also be attached to this lecture. Now here you can choose installers for different operating systems, and again, I'll start on macOS, and then here I'll click on Download the installer. Now on this page I got, again, various operating systems and various versions of PostgreSQL, and you can simply choose the latest version for your operating system, in my case macOS, and I'll download that. So now this download starts, and it can take a couple of seconds, and thereafter we'll walk through that installer to install PostgreSQL on our system. Now the download finished for me, so I will now execute this installer. And at the beginning, I have to enter my password here, so my Mac user password, so I'll quickly do that. And this does now install the PostgreSQL server and also the PostgreSQL client, the shell client, so this command line tool. This will both be installed in one step. I'll click Next here. I'll keep the default installation directory. And here we can now choose what should be installed. And again, I'll install the command line tools and PostgreSQL server. And I'll also install the other tools here. Click Next, keep that default for the data directory. So that's the directory where the data will be written to, the actual database data. Because again, the database is just software that manages the storage of data. Ultimately, it will still be stored on the hard drive, and that's the folder where it will be stored. And then I'll click Next. And now, just as with MySQL, if you followed through the installation of that, we have users for this PostgreSQL server. Because not everyone should be able to connect to the database server, because we have data on there that should be protected. And therefore, as part of the installation, a default user is set up for that database server, and it will have a name of Postgres. So that is the default user's name. And you have to choose your password now for this user. For MySQL, the name was root, by the way. For PostgreSQL, it's Postgres. That's something to keep in mind. And now I'll choose a password here. And for convenience, I'll use the same one as I chose for MySQL and click Next. And now you can choose a port number. Now that is the port number that will be used by this PostgreSQL server, and that is the port number that has to be used for connecting to that server. And I'll stick to that default here. For MySQL, the default was 3306. For PostgreSQL, it's 5432 here. I'll keep that default and click Next. Now here we can keep the default, click Next again, and click Next, so that now, after clicking Next again, everything is installed and configured. So let's wait for this installation to finish now. And the installation did finish for me here. And now I'll uncheck this here, this stack builder thing, and click Finish. Now with it installed, you should be able to go to your applications in your Finder, and there under P, you should find your PostgreSQL and then whichever version you chose folder. And in there you got various tools. For example, pgadmin 4. If you double click on that, you will start a tool that allows you to administrate this SQL server. Now when you start this pgadmin tool, for the first start, you're asked to set a password for a user for this pgadmin tool. So that's not your database server user, but a specific user for this administration tool. And I will set a password here. And now here, you will be able to start new PostgreSQL servers. Here on the left, you actually should have one server already. And now I'm prompted to enter the password for that Postgres user on that server, which we chose during the installation. And then here, you can, for example, remove that server and change the server configuration, though at the moment I'm absolutely fine with it, and therefore I'll just close this tool and leave it like this. Now we also got this SQL shell, which we can double click, and this will then give us this command line client, which connects to this running database server, which can be used for sending commands to it. But again, that is something we'll see later. So for now, I'll just close this and terminate this session. And that was the installation of PostgreSQL for macOS. Let's now install it for Windows. Now on Windows, you again can search for PostgreSQL installation, and you should find this download page at some point here then. This downloads page, which also is linked to this lecture. And there, we now of course want to choose Windows. Click download the installer, and then choose the installer for the latest version of PostgreSQL for Windows here. So now this will download this installer for Windows. And once this is downloaded, we can start this installer. Here it is, and then go through that. Now again, I'll keep the default path for installing it. You can of course change that. And I'll install all these tools here so that we got everything we need to work with PostgreSQL. Click Next. And I'll keep that default data directory as well. Click Next again. And now we need to set up a password for our user. Now I mentioned it before, but in case you skipped all of that, our database server has users because not everyone should be able to connect to our database just like this. Of course, that doesn't matter too much as long as it's running on our local machine, but if it would be deployed to the web, to a remote machine, and a real application would be connecting to it, we of course would want to ensure that it's only that application that connects and not any other users, so that the data in the database is protected. Therefore, just as MySQL created a default user, PostgreSQL creates a default user for the database, in this case named Postgres, and you have to set a password for that user, which is just what I'm doing here. And we'll need that later for connecting to that database. Now I'll click Next. Keep that default port for which it will listen for incoming connections. So that's the port which we'll need to use to connect to this PostgreSQL server. And choose Next again. Keep the default locale, Next and Next. And Next again to install everything. And now this will install all these PostgreSQL tools on our system. So let's wait for this installation to finish now. Now the installation finished, and I'll not start Stack Builder here, and click Finish. Now with PostgreSQL installed, if you go to your Windows Start menu, under P, you should find a PostgreSQL folder. And in there, you now got this pgadmin tool, which you can use to connect to your PostgreSQL server for administration. If you open this tool for the first time, you will be prompted to set a password for this tool specifically. So not for a database user, but for a user of this tool, which is the administration tool for your PostgreSQL servers. So let's wait for this to start up. Now we're prompted to set this password for this tool, so I'll do that. Doesn't have to be the same one as for your database. And here you can then manage your servers. Now it's prompting me for the password of the user of that server to connect to that server. And you can now manage the server and administrate it in various ways, though we'll not do that right now. You can also right-click on this to remove that server if you wanted to get rid of it. But I'll just close this pgadmin tool again, because right now there is no administrative action that I would want to take. So I'll just leave this. And instead, I'll now focus on a different tool, which was also installed. If I go to P, and that is this SQL shell, which is this command line client that was installed, which can be used for running commands. So we can start this to connect to our server and run commands. But just as with the MySQL command line client, we'll do this in the next lectures. For now, PostgreSQL is installed, and therefore we did everything we have to do, and we can now finally continue to connect to these database servers which we did install, before we then can dive into learning more about the SQL language. Over the last lectures, we installed our database software, the database servers. We started those servers and also some clients. Now in this lecture, I want to show you how to use these clients to run commands. And I'll start with the MySQL command line client for macOS. But in this lecture, I'll cover all these clients we installed for the different operating systems. Now we can run MySQL in the terminal here on macOS. This command should be available to connect to our database, to the MySQL server. Of course, for that, you need to ensure that the MySQL server is up and running. That's the case in general for this lecture. Your database servers need to be up and running. Now, to connect to the MySQL database with this MySQL command line client, you type MySQL and then a blank, and then --host, and set this equal to localhost, which refers to your local machine. That's a special placeholder name, identifier of your local machine. This tells MySQL that we want to connect to a MySQL server running on our local machine. Next, we add --user and set this equal to root. That's the database user we want to use for establishing the connection, and we need to specify such a user, otherwise we won't be authorized to connect to the server. And this root user is the default user that was created during the MySQL installation. Next, we add --password and set this equal to the password we chose for this user. So here I'll enter this password which I chose. Alternatively, you can omit this and you will then be prompted during the connection process. But here I'll type it out like this. It's just a dummy password I'm using for this course anyways. If you chose a different port than the default of 3306 during the installation and configuration, you can also add port and set this to your port. If you do use the default of 3306, you don't need to set this though. And so now we could hit enter to connect. I will show you the version without the password though, where you instead would just enter -p to tell MySQL that you do want to enter a password, but not here, but instead you want to be prompted for it during the connection attempt. And then I'll hit enter. Using -- password as we had it a couple of seconds ago would have also worked though. Now I'll hit enter and now I'm prompted for the password. And the advantage of this method is that as you type the password, which I just did here, it's not showing up on the screen. So if someone is standing behind you and you don't want to expose your password, this is preferable to using -- password with the written out password in the command itself as we had it before. So now I entered my password, the characters just aren't displayed for security reasons, and I'll hit enter. And now we connected to this MySQL server. If you get any error, make sure the server is up and running and that your credentials are correct. With that, however, we connected. And we can now run a simple first SQL command like select hello world, like this. Hello world between quotes. Add a semicolon thereafter and hit enter. And now you should see hello world as our output here. Now, this is just a dummy example, not doing anything useful, but it shows that we did connect. You can always disconnect by typing quit thereafter. As an alternative to this shell, you can use MySQL Workbench. Now, we also installed MySQL Workbench before, and therefore we can start MySQL Workbench as an application here on macOS. And the first time you do this, macOS might block it. You should then enable it in your security settings and open it anyways. And this gives you this graphical user interface where you should see your database server, and you can click on this server then, and now you are connecting to it. Again, with this default username, and then that password for that default database server user which you chose during the installation. In my case, this tester's password. And now I connected to it, and here inside of MySQL Workbench, you can do a lot of things. You can administrate your server, and you can also run queries. You can always run queries in those query tabs here, and you can open new query tabs by going to File, New Query tab. And in here you can run SQL commands like select hello world, like this, and then click on this flash to execute it. And then you see the result down there. This is a bit clunky. This is not the user interface we'll be using throughout this course, but this is one possible client you can use to have a graphical user interface. And an advantage of this client can be that, for example, under schemas, you will be able to see all the databases and all the tables in all these databases which you have on this database server. At the beginning, there is a default sys database which holds some metadata, but as we create more databases with more data throughout this course, they would show up here as well. And this graphical user interface, therefore, can be nice to work with, and definitely feel free to play around with it. For the majority of this course, we'll be using a different client which is less overloaded though. Now that was how we connect to MySQL. Now to connect to PostgreSQL, we got this PostgreSQL folder here under Applications. And there we can execute the SQL shell command to connect to our server, like this. Now when you execute this tool, it first of all establishes the connection and it asks you a couple of questions. For example, which server you want to use, and it shows the default setting, which it will assume if you don't enter anything here between square brackets. And indeed, localhost is the server, the hosting address to which I want to connect, since the PostgreSQL server is running locally on my machine. So I'll just hit enter to confirm this default. The database to which I want to connect is Postgres. We haven't created this yet, but I will just use this default for now. The port is 5432. Unless you changed it during the installation, you want to stick to that. The username is Postgres. That was that default user that was generated during the installation. So I'll confirm that by hitting enter. And then you have to enter your password. And the characters are not showing up here as you type, but they are registered. And once you entered the password, which you chose for the database user during the installation, you can hit enter to connect. And now you're connected to this PostgreSQL server. And there you can now also run commands like select hello world and semicolon thereafter. And then you will see hello world. We could have also entered this in one line, but we'll learn more about this SQL syntax in the next lectures and sections. So this works, and this is how we can now connect to the PostgreSQL server to run SQL commands. In this case, just this dummy command here. You can always close this window and terminate this session if you're done for the day. Now let's also see how we connect to databases on Windows. And let's start with MySQL and the MySQL shell. For this, you can go to the Start menu and search for the MySQL shell here, and then just open this tool. This will now open up a special shell where you can execute special commands here on Windows. And specifically, you can execute a shell.connect command, which requires some arguments though, but then this command will connect us to our MySQL server. So shell.connect it is. And here we now need to add various parameters, as it's called, for establishing this connection successfully. To be precise, you need to add curly braces here, opening and closing, between those brackets that belong to connect. And then here, between those curly braces, you can add a host key, and then a colon, and then between single quotes, localhost. This is an identifier that refers to your local machine, and since this database server is running on our local machine, this is how we tell MySQL that we want to connect to a database server that's running on our local machine. If we had a database server that would be running on some other machine with a different domain name or IP address, we could specify that domain name or IP address here, but for development, we choose that server that's running on our local machine, which has this special localhost identifier. Then, separated by a comma, you can add a user key here, and I zoomed out a bit so that this fits into one line. And the user here should be root, which is that default database user that was created during the installation of the MySQL database server. We need to specify this because you always need to connect with some user credentials to the database server, since that is the server's protection. Without a valid username-password combination, you won't be allowed to connect. Now you can also add port and set this to a different number than the default if you chose a different number. But here I did use 3306, which is the default during the installation, so we don't need to specify this, and instead we can hit enter. And now we're prompted for the password for this root user, which is this password you assigned during the installation of the MySQL database server. So I'll enter this here. And it will be hidden here, which is very convenient, so that if someone is standing behind us, he or she won't be able to see it. And we can now hit enter. You can also choose whether you want to save that so that you don't have to enter it again in the future. And now we are connected to this MySQL server. And here we can now run SQL commands. For example, select hello world with hello worlds between single quotes and a semicolon thereafter. Now out of the box, you will get an error here, unexpected string, because you first of all have to switch the language to SQL, and you do this by typing a backslash and then SQL. This will now switch to SQL mode, as you can now tell by SQL showing up here, and thereafter you'll be able to run SQL commands like select hello world between single quotes and a semicolon. And then you should see an output like this. And that's how you could use this MySQL shell on Windows to connect to the running MySQL database server. Now an alternative will be the MySQL workbench, which you can also start through the Start menu here. This will be a graphical user interface for connecting to a MySQL database server. Once it starts up, you can click on your running database server here, and you'll be prompted for the password for this root user, just as we were before in the shell. So we should enter this. And now here we have a graphical user interface with which we can work. Now you can do a lot of things in there, and definitely feel free to play around with it. For example, here, if you click on schemas, you can see all the databases and their tables that are stored on this database server right now. Initially, we just have a sys metadata database, but we'll add more databases with more tables throughout this course. And you can always run new queries in these query tabs here, which you can also create with File, New Query tab. And here you can run SQL commands like select hello world, as we just did it, and then always execute them by clicking on that flash. And then you see the output down here and a little log here at the bottom. Now, this is not the interface we'll be using throughout the course. We'll use a different one, but you could, of course, use that if you preferred it. And as I mentioned before, definitely feel free to play around with it. But that's how you can connect to the MySQL database server. We also installed PostgreSQL, and to connect to this, you can go to the Start menu and there to P. And here you also find the SQL shell here, which you can now execute. In there, when you start it, you're asked a couple of questions to establish the connection. For example, first of all, you have to enter the server address of the server that's running the database engine. In our case, we're running it on the local machine, so localhost, which is the default, is fine. The default setting, which will be assumed if you don't enter anything, is always shown between these square brackets here during this connection process. So here we want to use this localhost identifier, and therefore we can just hit enter. As a next step, we have to choose a database on this server with which we want to interact. And we can stick to the suggestion here to Postgres. It doesn't matter too much. We'll create our own databases later anyways. So I'll keep that default and hit enter again. Now we have to choose the port. And unless you changed that during the installation, you can stick to the default here as well. Otherwise, you should enter the port which you chose during the installation of PostgreSQL. And next you have to specify the username of the database user, which you do want to use for establishing the connection. And Postgres was the default username that was assigned and created during the installation process, so I'll keep that and hit enter again. Next we have to enter the password for that user which we chose. And as you type, characters won't be showing up here, but they will be registered. So you enter the password which you chose for that user during the installation of the PostgreSQL server, and then you hit enter, and this will now connect you to this PostgreSQL server. And here you can now run SQL commands like select hello world with hello world between single quotes and a semicolon thereafter. And you should see some output like this thereafter. And that's how you will now be able to talk to that SQL, to that PostgreSQL server, and run queries against it. Again, that's not the client we'll be using, but that would be one client you can use. Now, in the last lectures, we installed all those database servers and we saw a lot of clients in action. Now, we'll not use any of these clients, though you could do that if you prefer them. But instead, for the reasons mentioned earlier, so that we can easily save and make our commands available to you, we'll use Visual Studio Code with a special extension that makes connecting to SQL Server databases and running queries very convenient. The first step is to install Visual Studio Code, which is a free editor, a free code editor, which you can use for programming with all kinds of programming languages. And here you can visit code.visualstudio.com to download it for your operating system. This will give you an easy-to-use installer through which you can simply walk to install this editor on your system. Now, we're not going to write a lot of code. We're not going to use Python or anything like this here. This is not a Python or JavaScript course after all, but with help of a special extension which we'll install, we can use Visual Studio Code as a great client for talking to SQL databases. So I will download Visual Studio Code, and install it on my system by walking through that installer. And once you did install Visual Studio Code, you can start it. Now, when you started it, you might see some welcome page, which you can simply close, and you might have more elements here. I chose a very minimal look here. Under View, Appearance, you can, for example, show or hide a sidebar. You can show or hide the status bar. But again, I switched to a very minimal mode. Under Preferences, you can also choose the color theme. And here I'm using the Dark Plus theme, but you can, of course, also use a different theme here. You can really configure this editor to have the look and feel you want. Now, what I want to do here is I want to go to View and then Extensions, because we can install extensions, plugins you could say, into this editor, which add new functionalities. And here we want to search for SQL tools, actually without a blank, so that we find this SQL tools extension here, and we install that. That is the extension which I'll use to turn Visual Studio Code into a client that is able to connect to SQL databases. Now, with that installed and the SQL databases up and running, what you can do is you can go to View and under Appearance show this activity bar, and there you should have this SQL Tools, a tab, so to say. There you can now add a new connection to establish a connection to one of your database servers. In our case, the MySQL or PostgreSQL servers. And it works the same on both macOS and Windows. So here I'll click on Add New Connection. And as a first step, you need to install drivers for the database engines you want to connect to. Now, initially, we don't have any drivers. So as a first step, we click on Search VS Code Marketplace. And then here we want to use the SQL Tools MySQL driver, the MySQL MariaDB driver, and click Install. And use the SQL Tools PostgreSQL driver. So we installed that as well. Once these drivers were installed, you can close this and go back to this database tab. And now if you click on Add New Connection, you should have MySQL and PostgreSQL and other options which don't matter to us right now. Now I'll start with MySQL and click on this. And now here we have to give this connection a name. And I'll choose MySQL 1. This is just an identifier which will allow you to identify this connection because it will be stored so that you can easily reconnect in the future. I'll connect with server and port, keep localhost here since I want to connect to this database server that's running on my local machine, and keep the default port. And then here under database, we choose the default database which we want to use on that server. And I'll name it default here. We can create different databases and switch databases later. Now for the username, we'll use root because that is that user that was created automatically. And for the password, I'll choose ask on connect. Now we can keep the other defaults and then test this connection here. Enter our password here at the top when prompted. And you see this worked. And therefore now we can click Save Connection to save this connection for the future. You can now click Connect Now and enter this password again to establish a connection. And in here, you can now run your SQL statements. For example, select Hello World. And you can see one advantage here. As you type, you get auto-completion. For example, the insert command is suggested here. So it helps you find working commands. But even though this all seems to work, you will see that if you now enter a command here, like select hello world, and you click on run on active connection, this will fail. The reason for this is that we used this strong authentication method for our user during the installation of the MySQL server. Now you want to use that if you would host this on a real server that is exposed to the world. This extension fails to connect to MySQL Server if we are using this authentication method though, and here during local development, there really is no reason to use it. You don't have to use this strong method since it's just a development database server with which only we connect anyways. To work around that, what you can do is you can open MySQL Workbench, both on Windows and macOS, and connect to this again. And in there, execute a new query now. So here I opened a new query tab. And the query which we should execute here is the alter user query. Then between single quotes root at between single quotes localhost, identified with MySQL native password by, and then enter your user password here. This will alter this user, this database server user, to use a more simple authentication protocol in the end, which will be supported by this Visual Studio Code extension. Again, for local development, this is absolutely fine and allows us to use this extension, which will make working with SQL pretty convenient. You also find a file with this command attached to this lecture. Once you enter this, you can execute it. And once you did that, you can go back to Visual Studio Code, to your connection here. Close this connection by clicking this icon and connect again by clicking this icon again. You might be prompted to enter your password again. And if you now enter a command like select hello world here, and you click on run on active connection, you will actually still get an error, but now the error is that the default database doesn't exist yet, which makes a lot of sense because we haven't created that database yet. But the connection succeeded, otherwise it wouldn't be able to see that this database doesn't exist yet. And we'll take care about creating databases later anyways. So this is actually something which we can accept, and this proves that we are able to connect, even though we get this error here. By the way, you can also see why using this extension instead of Visual Studio Code could be a good idea, because here we actually also get some kind of auto-completion so that we see which commands are valid, and we get some syntax highlighting, which makes it much easier to enter correct commands and find and fix errors, especially as your commands get more complex. Now that was how you can connect to MySQL. Now I also want to establish a connection to PostgreSQL, and for this I'll click on Add New Connection here and choose PostgreSQL and give this an identifier, choose server and port and keep the defaults unless you change the port. As a database here I'll choose Postgres, which is that same database we used before with the Postgres shell client, and for a username I'll use Postgres, which was that default username that was created during the installation process. I'll keep these other settings here and then click Test Connection and enter my user password. And now that this worked, I'll click on Save Connection. And thereafter, I'll click on Connect Now and enter my password again. And here we can now run queries against PostgreSQL, and you can see in the file name here at the top against which database I'm running commands. So here I can again run select hello world, run on active connection, and here it actually succeeds and shows me this success message because that database to which I connected here, Postgres, actually does already exist on this server. But again, we'll make sure that MySQL works later as well. And this therefore is how I will be running my commands. This is the tool the client will be using throughout this course, where we have our results here on the right, commands here, and our connections here. And this will allow us to quickly switch between the different database servers, and it will allow us to store these files with the commands and make them available to you so that you can compare our commands to yours. And in addition here, we got this syntax highlighting, which makes it easier to see and understand these commands, especially as they get more complex, and it makes it easier to find and fix errors as well. So in the previous course lecture, We did set up Visual Studio Code, this code editor, but we're not really using it as a code editor. Instead, we installed this SQL Tools extension with the drivers for MySQL and PostgreSQL so that we can work with that for talking to our databases. And there we got one problem to fix with MySQL, and I also want to briefly dive into this extension again and talk about how we will use it in this course. Now let's start with that part actually. For one, it is important to understand that you can manage your connections here on the left. And that's very convenient because that means that if you take a pause, take a break, and you come back to this course or to SQL in general after a couple of days, you don't have to run this whole please connect me command again as we did before with other clients. Instead, you can go back into this extension and just click this connection button, this green connection button here, to establish a connection to the database again. And that works for both MySQL and PostgreSQL. And if you're done for the day, you can of course always close that connection. Now it's also worth noting, if I quickly connect to both databases again, that you can switch between these connections by simply clicking on them. This will focus a different SQL file here at the top. You see the two tabs are alternating, and that allows you to pick the database against which you want to run a certain command. And I'll zoom in a bit here so that these commands are a bit bigger. Now, if you then have a certain command that you want to execute, you can of course easily copy and paste it to also try it against the other database server. And that's one of the reasons for using this extension, or for us using this extension for this course, because it allows us to test certain commands against MySQL and PostgreSQL, which in turn allows us to highlight differences between these different database servers. Because as mentioned before, even though SQL is pretty standardized, there are minor differences between different SQL database servers, and we can easily identify such differences if we can easily run queries against different databases. So that's why it's pretty nice that we can switch just like this. Now we can ignore the bookmarks feature here. What is nice to have though is this query history here. If I select Postgres and I type this command, and I then run it by clicking this Run on Active Connection button here, we see the result here on the right, but we also get a new history entry here. And you can easily go to the history and click on one entry to paste the command from in there into your command file here. So now it was duplicated. If it would be empty and I click here, it would be inserted into this empty file instead. And you can also click this Run button here to immediately re-execute it without even copying it or typing it here again. So this allows you to quickly re-execute commands you executed in the past without having to type them again. Now here in this result window which we have here, we also have a button to rerun a query quickly. And we can also export the results that we get here into a CSV or JSON file, which can be convenient if you have certain results that you fetched from a database and you want to export them into a separate file. So these are two features which are also nice to have. You can click on console here to also see a little log message about the command which you executed here at the bottom. In this case, that it executed successfully. So that's how you can work with that. And you can, by the way, also take this result tab here and drag this here to the bottom to open it in the bottom half if you want to have this look instead. And this is a look we will use sometimes throughout the course to organize our windows such that you can quickly see both the command that was executed and the result that was yielded by that command. Now, if we move back to the left side here, it's also worth noting that here for our connections, you can also see databases for the different connections that you established. For example, here we connected to the Postgres database. And here, if we expand this and I shrink this here, we can actually see the schemas. And if we expand the public schema, we can see that in there we got actually the tables and some other things which we'll learn about throughout this course. Here under tables, we would see any tables that have been created. But at the moment, we haven't created any tables yet, therefore we don't see anything here. But this will also become useful later in the course once we do have tables with which we interact, because we can inspect them here as well. Now for MySQL, we don't see a database, and I get an error if I try to expand this, because there you might remember that we actually failed to connect because we don't have the database, the default database to which I am trying to connect. For Postgres, this was different because there a database was created during the setup process. Here for MySQL, this fails. And therefore, this is the last thing I want to take care about here. I want to make sure that we do have such a default database so that connecting to MySQL succeeds as well. Now for this, you can open up MySQL Workbench again. Both on macOS and Windows will do the same thing. And in MySQL Workbench, you can go to the Schemas tab here on the left, which allows you to control the databases that we want to have here on this database server. Here on Windows, the Schemas tab is also on the left side, but at the bottom here. Now, once you're in the Schemas tab, you can right-click in there and choose Create Schema, and then give this schema a name. And I'll choose default because a schema here in the end will be our database. The database which we want to add to the server. And since I'm trying to connect to a default database in the Visual Studio Code extension, I want to choose default here as a schema name, as a database name, so to say. You can keep all the other defaults and then click Apply. This will then execute this command here, which again will in the end create a database. So I'll click Apply here, click Finish thereafter, and therefore once you did that, you can close this connection, this MySQL connection here, and reconnect, and enter your password again. And now you should see the default database here as well, with the tables that it might hold, which at the moment are none because we have no tables yet. But now you can also try this SQL statement here again, this SQL command, run it against the MySQL database connection by clicking on Run on Active Connection. And this should now also not give you an error anymore, but instead return this dummy output here, this result here. So this is now also working. And therefore now to conclude this lecture about this setup, which we'll use in this course, I now just want to show you how we can switch away from these windows which we have here for running the commands, which are opened and focused whenever we switch the connection, to files that we can actually store in a folder, which we can then execute whenever we want to execute them. So that we don't just have this on-the-fly execution mode here, where we enter a command and execute it, which is very useful, but so that we can also write commands in separate files and store commands in files therefore, which is not something you always need to do, but which we want to do as part of the course here, so that we, the instructors, Max and Manuel, can give you access to these commands we executed. Therefore, we need to store them in files. And the advantage for you if you store your commands in files is that if you're coming back after a day or two, you can dive back into your latest exercises and play again with the commands you executed there without having to retype everything. Now for that, I'll close these two windows with a shortcut or by clicking on the X here without saving them. And I'll close these connections here, though that's not necessary. But then I'll go back here to this Explorer view, and I'll now open a folder so that I don't just have Visual Studio Code opened, but that I instead open a folder on my hard drive with Visual Studio Code. This will allow me to manage files from inside Visual Studio Code. Now for this, I created a folder, this SQL Complete Guide folder, which I selected here. And now we got that folder opened up here, and you can now add files to that folder through Visual Studio Code, but they will really be stored on your hard drive. For example, here, we can click this button here, or use the appropriate shortcut, which you can manage through the shortcuts setting here. There you can view and rebind shortcuts. So here I'll create a new file and name this test.sql. The extension is .sql because that will ensure that this extension which we added, this SQL tools extension, will recognize this file and will offer us to execute it. Because that's the nice thing. I can now just type a command in there, like the good old select hello world, and run that on an active connection. But it's now not just typed on the fly in some window that was opened up by the extension, but instead it is typed in a real file. And if I save that file with Ctrl S or Command S on macOS, this text, this command is really stored in the file. If I close this and reopen this, it's still there. Now we can still go back to the database, to the SQL Tools extension tab here, and for example connect to PostgreSQL again. And once we did that, we can go back to our file and run that on the active connection. And it's now executed against PostgreSQL. So it's very similar to what we did before, but we're not running commands in this on-demand window which opens up automatically, but in files which actually live on a hard drive and which therefore allow us to store the commands for the future. So whilst we will continue to use these on-demand windows here throughout this course, as we did before, we will also store commands in files in this course, so that we have stored them on a hard drive and we can execute them from inside that file with help of that extension that we installed before. And that is therefore it for this setup, for this playground, for this environment that we will use in this course for working with our databases and most importantly, for working with SQL, because that is what this course is about in the end.